Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the first panel of FOIA Fest. My name is Jim Daley. I'm the news editor at the Chicago Reader. Thank you, everyone, for checking in on the chat. And I have used FOIA primarily to investigate the Chicago Police Department in the last couple of years. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. Lakeidra?
Hi, I'm Lakeidra Chavis. I'm a reporter with the Marshall Project, where I cover juvenile justice. Prior to that, I was a local reporter in Chicago, and I used FOIA primarily to do stories around policing, and then last year to do a story about the Attorney General's office as well.
Pascal?
Hi, everybody. I'm Pascal Sabino. I'm a reporter for Block Club Chicago. Block Club obviously really focuses on neighborhood news. I focus on the West Side neighborhoods of Austin, Garfield Park, and North Lawndale. I've used FOIA increasingly, occasionally on some environmental issues, pulling pollution permits and things like that. But more recently, I've been doing a lot of FOIA requests related to Chicago police strategy, traffic stops that Chicago police conduct, as well as for court records for a collaboration called The Circuit that is with Injustice Watch, DataMade, BGA, and some other partners focusing on the Cook County Circuit Court.
Casey?
Yes, my name is Casey Toner. I'm a reporter for the Better Government Association. I use FOIA all the time, everything from like building permits to city contracts. Big project was years ago, we used FOIA to get investigations for every single police shooting outside of Chicago and Cook County. And yeah, it's a great tool. And yeah, that's about it.
All right. So we're just going to sort of go through the narrative of FOIAing criminal justice, and I'm going to ask the panelists some questions, and then we'll have a time at the end for any additional questions that you might have, which you can drop in the chat. And you can drop into the chat at any time, and I'll keep track of them. So we'll start with starting the FOIA. So panelists, how do you know what you want to ask for when you're starting out working on a FOIA? Anybody can jump on this one.
Okay, so something I usually do is, depending on what it is I'm working on, I'll call around, and let's say I want to find out about I don't know, a building permit, right? And so I will call someone about the building permit, and I'll try to get specifics about the permit, like what's in the permit, what to ask for, and which department the permit comes from. It's really important when you put these requests in to be specific, because that way they won't wait 10 days and say, no, you can't have this because you weren't clear enough. So specificity is important, and I think like kind of reporting it out even before you ask for the request is important. And sometimes I'll go fishing and I'll just like ask for a bunch of stuff and I'll see what comes back. But if I'm working on something specific, I try to gather as much information about it as possible. I mean, dates, times, departments, addresses.
So going off of what Casey said, I think being specific is so important when it comes to FOIA, because there's so much data and so many public records out there, things that you probably wouldn't even think of as public records unless you kind of were really thinking about putting together a FOIA. And that's part of the beauty of FOIA. It's a way to ask questions where they can't really say no to you unless they can prove they have a really good reason to say no, which is really powerful when you're interacting with city government and policing and our justice system. And so when you're asking for example, if you're asking for some kind of records or data related to arrests, grab an arrest report, look at what those arrest reports look like? Look at all of the documents you can find that you can get your hands on, and that will tell you what you can ask for. Every time a public official fills out a form, every time you're waiting in line at the DMV and you have to write down a form or whatever, all of those forms are data, and that data is stuff that you can potentially ask for. I don't know about stuff at the DMV specifically, but all in general forms, all that stuff is recorded somewhere and ends up being something that you can ask for. And just being able to think about what kinds of stuff is documented, how is it documented, is just so useful. And so, like Casey said, doing some of that pre-reporting, talking to people, if you're working on something in the justice system, talking to attorneys, talking to people who work in public interest, talking to advocacy groups who kind of are really familiar with the work and can maybe get you one or two documents to just kind of build some of those questions for like what you're really asking for, is so helpful and helps you be really specific in knowing exactly what fields of data, what kinds of documents, what the names of those documents are, and who you should be asking for those documents will eventually be.
Did you want to add anything to that, Lakeidra?
Yeah, I think when it comes to FOIAing police departments specifically, the Chicago Police Department publishes all of its directives online. Most of the directives. So oftentimes I will go through and read them because they're very detailed in terms of what police officers are supposed to document, and use that to build out my FOIA and what I'm going to request, and see the information I can get back.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So when you want to file a FOIA to the police or another legal organization, how do you find the name of the FOIA officer or the email or the phone number, and where and how to FOIA them?
I feel like I'm pretty basic when it comes to this because I just Google. Oftentimes it's really easy to find. Sometimes you don't need to know the FOIA officer's name. It's pretty general, like a general email that you send the request to. A lot of cities are also using like third-party websites to submit FOIA requests as well. So I go through there, and when I'm trying to follow up, I'll just call the department and see if they can connect me with the FOIA officer. If it's a situation where I file the FOIA and I'm getting responses back from the department, but there's no name, which I feel like is increasingly common, you can just ask, who the FOIA officer is handling the request. So it'll make following up easier.
Just to add on that, I know a lot of times the press and communications office will have a close connection with the FOIA officers, if only so that, the comms team and their FLAC can kind of get ahead of any really jarring FOIA requests that are coming in, and just make sure that people, the leader of the department is prepared to answer to some of the questions that those records and that data might have. So you can also ask the city's press team within any particular department if they can share the name of the FOIA officer and get you in contact with them as well. And I've had success sometimes just talking to the press person and asking them if they could nudge along a FOIA request too, if you have a good relationship with them.
Yeah. And, it's also so like, for example, the Chicago police have a number of FOIA officers and a sergeant who's in charge of that division. And when you can talk to him, he can often help you out as well if a FOIA officer is not responding to you or something like that. And it's probably true for other departments as well. When you're starting out, how do you start with a broad FOIA question that allows you to kind of hone in on what you're ultimately looking for if you don't know the specific document to begin with or where the information might be?
I don't mind starting on this one. So my process, a lot of times I end up just filing lots of FOIAs, even for stuff that I don't necessarily need, which I'm sure is a huge pain to the FOIA officer, but it helps me get a look at like how Chicago Police, for example, is storing this data, which allows me to think more about how this data might connect to other pieces of data. And so part of that is, instead of asking for example, my reporting on traffic stops, instead of asking for data or records on all traffic stops going back to 2004, which is when they started collecting this data, I'll ask for like, oh, could you give me one specific beat, one small geographic area where there might be a really small number of records, but can give me still a good picture of what's going on there. Asking for that subset of records will let you know, am I on the right track? Do I need to be asking for a different data set? Or are there even records that this agency doesn't store? For example, when it comes to traffic stops, I was asking for data on the traffic stop itself, as well as citation records. I FOIA'd CPD for the citation records, and it turned out that they don't keep those records. I have to go to the Department of Administrative Hearings to get those specific like citations, because those are tickets and that has to do with finance and stuff. So CPD doesn't maintain those records. And so kind of asking for those things early on can save you a lot of time later, because you want to have a kind of a roadmap of what you're going to be asking for and how long it'll take you, because these things just do take time.
Anybody else want to add to that? Okay. Can you use records to find more records, and how do you do that?
Yeah, oftentimes. So I guess I have an example. Last year, I reported on CPD's ability to connect gangs to shootings in Chicago in terms of motivation and the cause of both non-fatal and fatal shootings. And I started out by requesting all of the case incident reports, which are very large documents on each sort of case that CPD investigates, and I was denied for unduly burdensome, and I think I was requesting probably a dozen requests. But I was working at a really small newsroom, and it just didn't make sense to try to sue for those records, and so that was kind of a dead end. And then I requested the gang audit reports that CPD compiles on suspected gangs, and gang territory maps, which the department has published every year for over a decade. And then I tried to find it, see if there was a story in there, and it was a little confusing and not as helpful as I thought it would be. So then finally, when I was requesting data that I requested pretty regularly, which was data on homicides and non-fatal shootings, I added in, to see if they had an indicator option of whether the shooting was gang related. And so that ended up really helping anchor the story and drive home some of the bigger data points in that piece. So it was an experience where I was requesting lots of different types of data on a specific issue and trying to sort of wade through what was the most helpful to be able to confirm that, one, there was a story there and what that story might look like.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a quote I like, and it's there's secrets within secrets, and like recently, I'm looking at some like right now, I'm looking at some jail deaths, right? And I was looking at the reports for the jail deaths that I got back from the sheriff's office, and then I noticed in there were some letters from the state police talking about how, in addition to whatever the sheriff did, the state police did their own investigation of the jail deaths, right? And so immediately I saw that, and I'm like, oh, that's something else I can get. And there's things like this all the time. And every document you'll get back, they'll usually reference like 7 or 8 other things, not always, but they'll mention other things that often belong in different departments. And if they do that, there's a record there. And I think that's just kind of wise to consider. I was looking at a story once where I found a transcript of a negotiation between a guy in his house and the cops, and the guy had a gun, or he had stuff in his house. And I saw that there's a transcript. This is a little bit different because it's not FOIA, but I saw the transcript, and I saw that, and I thought to myself, if there's a transcript of this negotiation, there's a recording of the negotiation. So just kind of keep that in mind. Like there's always string to pull, when you start getting records back.
So when you're starting out a FOIA, one of the very important things is time management, because these things are very time consuming and time intensive. So if you're not an investigative reporter in a unit that lets you just work on one story for a month, but have daily and weekly assignments, how do you mitigate that? How do you manage your time?
I'll jump in on this one because that's something that's been difficult for me. That's taken work, but I've been able to manage it with Block Club Chicago. I'm doing a lot of daily stories and a lot of neighborhood reporting, and working on balancing that with longer term data projects and investigative stories. It's hard, but part of that is just kind of knowing what you need to get done at the get-go, at the outset, because there's a lot of waiting when it comes to FOIA, like especially with a department like CPD. They'll almost always ask for an extension whenever you make a request, and so when you start your investigation, you're going to be filing all of these FOIAs, and then you'll kind of have time to kill. And what you can do is orient your daily reporting in a direction that will also potentially help you build sources, help you just make some other connections and do some of the groundwork that can eventually contribute to a full longer term investigative piece. But the other really important piece here is that communicating with your editors, setting expectations, and making sure that everybody's on the same page is really, really important. I feel so lucky with Block Club that my editors are so down to kind of give me a little bit of time away from my regular daily reporting to focus on some of the investigative stuff that I'm interested in. And so part of it really is just being able to kind of block out some time and say, hey, for 3 or 4 hours today, I'm gonna step back from some of the daily stuff and focus on some of the longer term stuff, and having a couple blocks like that throughout the week so that you can really chip away at some of these bigger pieces and have time in between it, so that maybe you'll be getting some of those FOIAs back. Maybe you'll have some collaborators who can bring some valuable insights to the table. That's been a really helpful way for me to do some of this.
Anybody else want to mention anything on that?
Yeah, I was at the Daily Southtown for 7 years, and it was just like covering like all the madness that occurs in the South suburbs, which is a lot. And but I just had a lot of luck just sending, try to send things out, like reserve like 10 minutes to yourself, 15 minutes to yourself, and just like send out like an email with a FOIA request in the morning before you leave, and just wait for stuff to come in while you're working on other stuff. And just try to just get it out the door, and don't think about it, but like just do it and get it done, and focus on other things. And when stuff comes back, you get the time to look at it. And what Pascal was saying, like, call your boss and let them know what you're doing, because they have their own expectations of you. But like, I think for the most part, people are excited about this stuff, and you say, hey, look, I have this records request. They'll go, cool, because this is a story that is not just like some local business coverage. Like, it's something that I would actually want to read and edit. So I think that a lot of times your bosses will be on board for this stuff because it's fun.
And one thing that I used to do before I came to Chicago and I worked in smaller or more rural places was that I would just build data sets on my own because I didn't know about FOIA, or I didn't really know how to file a FOIA when I first moved to Chicago. So when I would cover city council, for instance, when I was still a reporter in Alaska, I would do like very simple stories like who's attending, actually attending city council for all of the council members and things like that. So I think there are ways to do stories that are, accountability driven, that have data in it, even if you can't necessarily file a FOIA with your schedule or, wherever you are reporting in the country.
Yep. Thank you. Those were all great answers. So moving on, let's say you filed your FOIA, you've waited 2 weeks, and you have gotten a denial, and you think that the reason that they have denied your request is improper, or you have gotten no answer whatsoever, and you're miffed about that. What steps do you take, starting with the public access counselor? Anybody want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I've done this, but I mean, you can go to the public act, like the Attorney General has like an agency set up where you can challenge your denial, right? You can write them a letter, and you could try to show why you think you're in the right and why you think they're in the wrong. You can include some legal cases to help kind of mention some legal cases and try to craft an argument about why why you think you're correct. It is one of these things where it's like it's a tough process. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like it's like we were talking about this earlier in the week, where it's just like sometimes you just spend a lot of time and doesn't really go anywhere. But other times, like there's been instances where I challenged stuff and I won, but there's been other times where I challenged stuff and I still didn't get what I want. But like the agency had to talk about what they were doing, right? And I was able to like there's a guy who is like there's like porn on a phone or something like that belonged to a fire chief, and the phone went missing. The only reason I found out that the phone went missing was because they had to mention it in their argument back to the Attorney General's office. So, so you just have to put the request in and make a good argument and set a date on your calendar 1 year from now and get back to it. Not to be too bleak, but
The one time I filed an appeal with PAC, it was really successful, and I got the records in like 2 months. So there is hope. But I guess another avenue that you could take before, trying to appeal to the Attorney General's office is just asking, like following up with the FOIA office and see if like they can still give you the records. Technically, it's a denial at that point. But I think sometimes FOIA officers just don't follow up with people on their requests. And so I think you can also go the route of just asking if they can still provide you the records.
And if it's something really obvious, like something that they really should turn over to you and they're just not, or they have some really flimsy excuse, like you could just call them and make the argument, and sometimes they'll just turn it over. You could say, look, I know I'm in the right here, and there might be some miscommunication, but I think you really should turn over these records because the process we're going to go through next is like, you're not going to like it. I'm not going to like it. And I've had some luck, like what you're saying, like I've had luck just like talking to people, unless they're huge jerks, but like, well, I don't think most people are jerks. And so you can have some luck with that.
Let's say you don't have luck with that. Should you sue to get your records? And then how do you go about doing that usually? Who's your favorite law office for that in Chicago?
We use, I don't make like attorney referrals just as like a rule. We use Lovey and Lovey in that topic because he's been our staff attorney for a while. But like the thing I think is like important about the lawsuits, and I think it's like a really beautiful part of the law that like I don't even know. I think the legislators might have just like overlooked it when they wrote the law, but the law allows for attorneys to recoup their legal fees, which can be really expensive. And so for really obvious FOIA denials, it makes the ask of an attorney to file the lawsuit pretty simple because they could just do a little bit of work and get paid at the end of it. And I know Topic and Lovey and Lovey do some like pro bono stuff too. But we have them on retainer at the BGA. And I know that's not like a luxury that, other people have. So I feel like I can't talk about it too much.
Yeah, and I'll just mention too, there are attorneys at FOIA Fest. I highly recommend you talk to them if you have a FOIA that is troublesome, that they're not getting back to you, because they will help you. How can you go ahead?
I was just going to say, if you're in a newsroom that doesn't have a lawyer on staff, or they don't have the finances to hire a lawyer for FOIA denials, one way that I've gone about it in the past is that I will do what Pascal was mentioning earlier, which is to substantially narrow the time frame of information that you're requesting. Sometimes that helps, or I'll just like refile and ask for something slightly different. So there are ways to get around it, even if you don't have the means to have like a lawyer, you know, kind of fight for you to get those records. There's still like lots of options that you have. You just have to sort of think through them a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you have strategies? I think you sort of touched on this a little bit, but do you have any other strategies for avoiding denials in the first place when you're either making your requests narrow or, you know, using your experience from previous requests to limit their ability to deny your request beyond what you already talked about?
So one thing that can be helpful is talking to the FOIA officer up front and just kind of asking what is on the table, like what's reasonable and what's not, so that you can kind of temper your expectations and make it as easy as possible for them. Because at the end of the day, the FOIA officer is just a person who has a job who, you know, sometimes their job is not easy to do. And so just making it easy for them can make you less likely to get denied. Asking for the right thing is really important. One thing that has been helpful for me, if you've seen a similar data set or if you've seen similar public records, like send them a copy. Like say like these are the fields of data I want. I want the data that was used to create, for example, in my reporting on traffic stops in Chicago, I was asking Chicago police for a data set on traffic stops that the state, you know, the state's transportation department was also collecting, and they assembled this traffic stop data into their annual traffic and pedestrian stop study. So to be very specific about what I was asking, okay, to be honest, I wasn't very specific the first 2 or 3 FOIAs, which got denied. Okay, I'll admit it. I asked for this data, they kind of gave me the wrong thing or said we don't have that data or whatever. And eventually what I had to do was say, I want the data that you send to the Illinois Department of Transportation for use in this specific study. I want these fields in the data, which I know you have, because I know that the state's transportation department has these fields of data. And so being specific in that way and having kind of a reference point for them to use, like if you have a document, you say, I want the documents like this. If you have the names of the columns that you want in a data set, you can send them that so that they kind of have something concrete to work off of. And it also goes to show, like, I know you have this data. You're not going to deny me. I know what's going on here. And that just makes them kind of have to take you a little bit more seriously. On the other hand, if you do get denied, for example, by Chicago police, people besides Chicago police have some of that data. So if you can't get it from Chicago police, you can probably get it from the Illinois Department of Transportation, because their interests are aligned differently. And so maybe you could fight Chicago police and get those records there, or you could take the path of least resistance and ask for it from somebody who's really interested in actually getting some of this data out there to people. So just think about where that data intersects with other agencies that might also have stewardship over those records.
And just to follow up on that, sometimes I'll request data around race and gender, and I'll get a response saying we don't maintain this data. But oftentimes, especially for police departments, they report some of that information to the FBI, not always and not consistently, but you can always look through the FBI's data and say, well, you know, you reported this data in 2020 and 2018, so you have these records. So, you know, please provide them to me. Another example that I ran into when I was reporting on the Attorney General's Office Victim Compensation Program is I'd requested similar demographic information. They said they didn't maintain it, but I was able to get a copy of the application that people fill out, and on that form it asks for race information, which is optional, but they do have it, and they also ask for gender. So I just responded to them, you know, people fill out this information on the applications, and you are federally mandated, since you get part of the, a large part of the money from the federal government, to also provide the federal government with this demographic data. So you do have this information, and I think they still wouldn't provide it, and I ended up just requesting the actual copies of the actual applications. So it ended up being a lot more work for them anyway.
Yeah. Thank you all. Those are great answers. So let's say your FOIA has gotten a response. You're successful. You have dozens of pages of data, some of it redacted, some of it not. When you first open that PDF or envelope and you're inspecting your records, what should you be looking for immediately or immediately asking to interpret the data?
I would recommend actually referring back to your original FOIA that you filed and using that as a checklist to make sure that everything you ask for, especially if you ask for data, is all there. When I do get a spreadsheet, I make sure that none of the columns are sort of really close together. Sometimes that might be a field that's hidden or something like that. And if I ask for a specific time frame, I'll sort the data by date and just make sure I'm getting the time frame that I asked for. And so those are some things that I try to look out for. If I'm getting documents back, I try to scan through the page numbers to make sure there aren't like huge gaps in the pages that I'm requesting or that I think I should have gotten. And I always try to follow up with the FOIA officer to get an understanding of why something wasn't included. If the information isn't available, then they are required to tell you why they're not providing it. So if you're not getting any reasoning behind missing parts of your FOIA, that's something that you're definitely entitled to.
So when I get a FOIA request back, I always ask for a data dictionary, just so that I know when I'm looking at data, I want to know what each of the columns is really representing and not just guessing based off of the title of the column. And so if you ask for either a directory or a data dictionary, that will give you that information. And that's generally super easy to ask for. I've asked for that sometimes not from the FOIA department, but from just the press, the FLAC, the press secretary or whoever, and they'll get that to me like right away because it's super easy. And that will give you an idea of what you want to look for. Another thing that I do is I always group the data. Like I try to think, how can we just group things within the data so that we can look at some trends. And one way that I like to group things is geographically, because if we're talking about policing, if we're talking about inequity in Chicago, that stuff is just so geographic. We're in the city of segregation. Like if you want to see where stuff is clustered so that you can see how these patterns are peeking through. So with my reporting on traffic stops, what I was looking at was, well, initially I was looking at racial disparities, finding that 7 times more Black drivers are stopped by Chicago police than white drivers. And so that's just a very easy demographic grouping that we can do based off of the data that Chicago police sent out. But just thinking about like, how is this inequality distributed, I think is a really interesting question always. And so I like to think about what fields of data can we use to place where this is going on. And so what I did was I looked at there was a field of police beats. Police beats are pretty small. Sometimes they're like 3 blocks, like they're pretty small geographic areas. And so if you map it all out, you can see which neighborhoods are getting a lot of traffic stops and which neighborhoods aren't. And so grouping things out that way, I think can help you make a lot of connections, because once you see things going on there, you can start to ask for additional things to tell that story of, okay, there's all of these traffic stops happening in the Garfield Park neighborhood more than anywhere else in the city. What's going on there? That neighborhood, the police district is the 11th police district, and that gives you a pathway to start asking other questions, asking for more records about, oh, what kind of arrests are happening in this district? If there's this one particular random kind of police activity, what kind of arrests is that leading to? What kinds of complaints are we getting from people who have been in this situation? So we can FOIA for those complaint records, or use the Invisible Institute's database that they already have a lot of those complaint records public. And so just chopping up the data and chopping up records in certain ways, it gives you opportunities to kind of say, what's the story here? How can we go beyond just the data and start thinking about the narrative and making connections of what's really happening on the ground there.
One thing I just want to add is that I think if you're looking at sort of crime data over a period of time, especially, or even, I guess, sort of applications that are coming in from a different state agency, creating a quick graph that shows the sort of number of arrests, for example, or the number of applications submitted within the time frame you're looking at, and being aware if there are any sort of sharp trends. So for instance, if the data drops all of a sudden, or the data, it seems like there's a really sharp uptick, to me, sometimes that's concerning because there might be issues with the reliability of the data. So I always try to go back and ask them why this trend might be occurring, if there were any sort of policy changes that explains why these numbers look the way they do. And then I had another thing, but I forgot, but I feel like that's a big one because oftentimes departments, compile really messy data. There aren't standards for how they're keeping track of this information, how they're entering these records. We're not working with data that is clean. There are flaws in the data that we work with. So I think being cognizant of that is really helpful, especially when you're trying to ground that analysis in the story that you're working on.
And I'll add too, it may seem rather obvious, but read all of the documents that you get back. There's been a couple times where I got like a huge sheaf of documents back and I found what I was looking for early and started writing a story and then went through the rest of the documents and found far more information or like an entirely new story that wasn't even related to my original investigation. So read everything that you get back.
Yeah, there's I was going to say there's a line from Robert Caro, the great historian, and the advice his editor gave to him was turn every goddamn page, and I really believe that. Like, read everything because there's always little secrets.
When you've gotten a huge data set back, or if you are working on many FOIA requests that are related to the same story, how do you organize spreadsheets? How do you organize your investigation with spreadsheets? How much love do you have for spreadsheets as an investigative reporter?
Can I share my screen real quick? I think it's like the screen, it's like the little screen icon, right?
I think so.
All right, let's see how this goes. Okay. So I'm going to share this and I'll kind of explain it. All right. Do you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So this right here is a spreadsheet I created to track suburban police shootings. And if you could see, each one of these little rows here is a case, is like a police shooting that we looked at. And that's the case number, the date, the names of the people that were shot, the police officers, whether it was fatal, race, age, so on and so forth. And the reason I bring this up is because when we did this, we had, hundreds of cases. And, I'm looking at 10,000, 20,000 individual pieces of paper. But the only way you can really make sense of that is if you organize the little bits of data that are in these mountains of paperwork and you put them together, because that's the only way you can really make sense of it. And I know this might be very complicated, and it is very complicated, but I think the idea of this is just to show people like the world of possibilities that are open to you, one thing at a time. But I've had enormous success doing this because you can create meaning where none exists.
Yeah, I like that. Create meaning where none exists. Lakeidra or Pascal, do you have any thoughts about organizing your data or spreadsheets beyond what we've already covered?
I'm just taking notes because I need to get better at that. So.
Me too. Okay. All right. So I think we are ready to spend the last 10 minutes of this answering some questions from the audience. So I have a few here based on the chat. And if you have any more, please drop them in the chat now. We'll try to get to as many as possible. There were a couple of questions about when you get a denial because something is under investigation. So can you just talk about how law enforcement investigations impact FOIA, whether it's CPD, COPA, state police, and what you can do about that.
Well, I'll talk about the state police because I've had a lot of I've worked with them a lot, or they haven't worked with me a lot, but I've written just a lot about their kind of how it works over there. And whenever there's like a suburban police shooting, they will like take over the investigation. They also, I learned recently, do jail deaths, and they won't release it until it's done. So you'll just have to kind of wait for some. I mean, sometimes you can get the reports. The department might issue like a page or two about kind of what happened, but the thorough report, you have to wait, and it can take a year and a half or whatever. And the state police are just not a great, they're like overwhelmed, and it just takes forever. But in Cook County, the state's attorney reviews every investigation. And so you can get one of these investigations back from the state's attorney's office in 2 weeks, where it might take you 6 months to get it back from the state police. And so I've had a lot of luck with that. And once they release them, I mean, they're fairly complete. Like the state attorney doesn't really redact them too much. And so you're just able to get a lot of information about, what happens in these cases.
Thank you. We have had a couple of questions about what I think is the attorney work product exemption. Do any of you know anything about that or have any experience with that? I don't either. Okay, I'll move on for now. Do you have any advice for non-journalists? There's, who are wanting to file many FOIAs and don't want to be labeled a nuisance. Can you file FOIAs anonymously in Illinois? There's a follow-up to that.
I can answer the first question. I think one thing that helps is one thing we mentioned already, which is being as specific as possible to what you want and the records that you're going to request. I think avoiding language like pertaining to like any and all or something like that, that's sort of a catch-all vague term. It's not helpful for anyone, including the FOIA officer. And also, if you're requesting records related to the same sort of issue or topic, you can put that in the same request. So you don't need to file 5 different requests for something that can easily be sort of bullet pointed in that FOIA. Reporters do that all the time when we're requesting records. I wouldn't make it like a 10-point bullet thing for like several different types of records, but I think that's one way that you can sort of navigate that and not have like the FOIA officer be annoyed because they have 5 new requests for something that could really just be all in the same docket.
Yeah, and you can request stuff anonymously as long as you have an email address. Like there's like a very popular Chicago crime blog that no one knows who really runs it, and they put in requests all the time, and they get information back. So it's possible, just like create an email address and use that to file your FOIA requests and go from there.
Can a legal challenge be made to force public agencies to post public records to their website? I do not know. Nobody knows?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah. Can you legally challenge public agencies to force them to post records to their website to make them make the records?
No, but like sometimes like I've had luck in doing that. Like there's a village board that didn't put I think they have to post some things, like they have to put like meeting agendas and minutes. And I made a deal with them where I'm like, look, just put them online and you don't need to send them to me. All you need to do is just make the links active and make them work. So you can do that, but you can't really force them to, do stuff that's not required by law.
Yeah, thank you. What about prosecutors' offices? This is another attorney work product question that we don't really know the answer to. I'm sorry. Do any of you have preferences about what software you use to query and analyze your data once you have it?
Yeah, I use for real simple stuff, I use like Google Sheets, because they're just handy and it kind of saves the material and I could look at it from anywhere where I have my Gmail account. For more complex things, I'll use Excel. But then like recently I've been doing a lot of work with like big data sets. So I've been using R and SQL, which are great. There's a learning curve. There's a really great site called R for Journalists that I use. And like some of the mapping stuff recently, like there's a package in R called Leaflet, which is actually, I learned today, is a Ukrainian package. Let's see if I could find this link. But R I find is just really, really helpful because you can kind of like chop up the data and kind of put it back together and make like calculations. And you could, I used it to make maps of drug arrests in Chicago. So that's what I recommend.
I'm similar. I rarely use Excel. I usually use well, I have a Mac and I don't have Excel, so sometimes I'll use the Numbers app, which is terrible. So I use either R, but more likely I use SQL as a database manager because that allows you to query the information and ask for specific groups within the data. That's really helpful. For visualizations, there's a lot of just great free data visualization software out there. And so I use Flourish, which I think is a Google product, Google Flourish. They have some decent mapping software that will allow you to visualize the data, which allows you to also kind of come up with some new conclusions about some of the trends of what's going on.
Yes, I love Flourish, and I just dropped a link into the chat where they have they make it the whole thing free to newsrooms if you apply. Flourish they make you can make such gorgeous data on Flourish. Let's see. Next question is, the paper I work for doesn't have much of a budget for FOIA requests, and the county charges $1 a page. How do you persuade the government that fees are unreasonable and the press has a right to the documents without paying several $100s in some cases? Go ahead.
Well, if the records you're requesting are PDF, they are required to send you the records in the format that it's originally produced in. It's the same reason why they can't get away with sending you a PDF or a spreadsheet, for example. So if they have it in a PDF format, they should be able to send you zip files or something like that, so you can get the records.
You can. I found like with court, and I've done some decent court reporting where you can go and like ask for case files, and it should not charge you anything to like request a case file because every courthouse has them and they'll let you look at them. And if you have a camera on your phone, you should be able to take pictures of them. And you do run into, it gets expensive if you want court transcripts, because there's laws in Cook County about that says that like the court reporter's office can basically charge what they want. And so you do pay a premium for stuff like that. But I've had luck personally, like if a case gets appealed, those transcripts of court cases have to be produced like for the appellate court to review the files, right? And so when that happens, those court transcripts go into the public domain at that point because the appellate court has to review them, right? So you could just go through the court system and ask for the court case that was sent to the appellate court. And they should have it and they should give it back to you. And we did that. There's a judge who's the judge in the Jussie case. And he was basically blocked from taking sex crime cases because he reversed a jury verdict in this kind of horrific case. And we were able to get the entire transcript of the entire trial, which would have cost probably $1,000, if not more, just by asking for the appellate case.
All right. Well, I believe that's all the questions, and we're out of time. So thank you all for attending this. I hope it was helpful. Feel free to follow up if you have other questions. I'll drop my email in the chat and can forward emails to any of the panelists as well. So thanks a lot. Hope the rest of FOIA Fest is as good as this panel was. Bye, everybody.